Saga was yet another entry in the long-running Metal Max series that began all the way back in '91 on the NES, and is quite far from the epic RPGs that fans have come to expect. Instead, it offers up a somewhat open-ended adventure that takes place in a post-apocalyptic world where humanity fights for scraps of their technological past, and the more brave of them taken on the search of outlaws who can be taken out for cash. It's essentially a Mad Max RPG and sees you stepping into the shoes of a hunter who must build his very first tank in order to travel through the harsh and unforgiving world. As you travel, you'll begin to meet various people who share your goals, 5 of which have the potential to become your allies and join you in your fight. What lies at the core of the game though is this ability to build your own tank and constantly upgrade it with new weapons and armor that you'll find throughout the world. Thanks to this near endless supply of items, you'll be able to create a variety of different builds, which of course have a huge effect in battle. The combat system, although simple, offers enough quirks to make it interesting, and you can fight both in and out of your tank with a range of different weapons and attacks at your disposal. Helping to mix it up is the distance between yourself and the enemy, which takes on various states. First, you've got airborne, which makes your target difficult to hit if you haven't got any anti-aircraft weapons equipped. Next, you've got out of range, which can only be hit by using a sniper rifle or long-range missiles. And finally, underwater, which sees you having to use torpedoes or submersive weapons in order to get a hit. Despite a few issues with its story that only really ramps up towards the end of the game, there's plenty of side content to enjoy along the way. So if you're fond of old school open-ended RPGs, then Metal Saga is something I can fully recommend to try out. Shadow Hearts is a sort of spiritual successor to an often forgotten RPG on the PlayStation known as Delca, with Covenant being the second game in the series that sought to build upon the solid foundations set by the original on the PS2, and it manages to improve nearly every aspect in the process. Now, it's a bit hard to talk about the story without spoiling the first game, but many of the characters make a return, and you're once again set for another adventure that sees you exploring one of many different locations throughout Europe as you begin to unravel the mystery. The most defining feature of the series is its battles that all hinge on a pretty cool concept known as the Judgment Ring. Instead of simply pressing attack, heal or item, regardless of which action you take in Shadow Hearts, a small ring will appear on the screen, and you've got to hit a needle within specific zones in order to carry out your chosen action. If you can get the needle in the critical zone, your attack will come along with far more damage, or a significantly higher amount of HP if you're healing. It's a really great system, and on top of this, your party members each have specific roles to play in battle. One can fuse himself with monsters, whereas the other is much more proficient with magic, and finally there's one that specialises in swordplay, which all work together to create a pretty versatile amount of options when it comes to taking on enemies or one of the game's many challenging bosses. Each of the characters also come along with pretty lengthy side quests that offer a great distraction from the main story and help flesh out their individual backgrounds, making it more than worth it to explore the extra stories that the game has to tell. Covenant was a real improvement over the first game, and it's just a real shame that this series never reached the same heights of some of the bigger names on the system, as it more than deserved to do so. Jade Cocoon was yet another RPG that landed on the PlayStation that not many people played, and was instead overshadowed by the likes of Final Fantasy VII. The same can be said for its sequel, which never really got the attention it deserved and was all centered around a young boy known as Kahu, who was out to prove himself as a beast master, but after a strange turn of events he encounters an evil version of himself and inherits a curse, which sees him having to collect special items known as forest orbs in time, or he'll find himself consumed by his doppelganger. As far as the gameplay goes, it's got a lot in common with the likes of Pokemon that sees you exploring vast areas and collecting bigger and stronger monsters to join your team. The main standout though is just how many of them there are to collect, with hundreds populating the game and all bringing their own unique traits to each battle. Here's where the biggest change from the first game takes place, and all revolves around something known as the combat ring that surrounds Kahu during battle, and it's got up to 8 different spots for one of your monsters to sit on. 3 monsters will face forward at any given time, and each of the spots has its own elemental affiliation, so placing the right monster in the correct place is the key to landing higher amounts of damage. It's also important to have a well-balanced team that works well together, and with the almost overwhelming number of monsters, no two teams will be quite the same. Because of this, there's a lot of experimentation to be had, as well as plenty of side quests and diversions from the main game that help prolong the adventure, but in meaningful ways. Everything from collecting items to defeating special arenas, and even a 2-player mode that allows you and a friend to go head to head. Ultimately, this is one game any fan of the genre really can't afford to miss. Digital Devil Saga II is a spin-off of the popular Shin Megami Tensei series and picks up after the events of the first game and follows the cast as they emerge into the strange world known as Nirvana that was promised to be a place where prosperity flourished. The complete opposite is true though, and they find the world in decay and must set out on a new adventure to unravel the mysteries of the new realm. To be fair, the narrative is easily one of the game's greatest aspects, but it does have a tendency to be a bit dialogue heavy and routinely drops massive amounts of lore, where I feel it would have been better to scatter them a bit more evenly throughout the game's runtime, but it's nothing that ruins the experience as the gameplay more than makes up for it. Anyone familiar with the series will know exactly what to expect when it comes to the battle system, which sees you having up to 3 characters to use at any given time, but the concept of turns is flipped on its head. If you use an enemy's weakness against them, you gain a turn, but if you attack with something they block, you lose 2 turns, and if you happen to use something they absorb or reflect, you lose all of your turns. But the same goes for the enemy, and this is where the combat system really comes into its own. Going hand in hand with the battles is the character progression that all takes place on a grid-based board that is full of something known as mantras that hold different skills. By defeating enemies and earning AP, you'll slowly be able to unlock these moves and use them in combat for yourself, allowing you to decide how each and every character grows, lending the game a true sense of freedom when it comes to building your team. But to get the most out of it, it's a good idea to play the first game before jumping in, so if you can find it for a decent price or are looking for something new to emulate, Digital Devil Saga 2 is definitely worth it. After the success of the first games on the PlayStation, it was only a matter of time before the series would appear on the console's successor, and the third installment would ramp up the Wild West theme to new heights, with you taking on the role of 4 drifters, who are people that wander the land seeking treasure. Each of them have their own backstory to tell, and ultimately end up together with the fate of the world in their hands as they work towards stopping an ancient prophecy from becoming true. The story ends up being surprisingly quite deep, with plenty of twists and turns to keep you guessing as you travel the world of Legaia and come into contact with one of many different factions that are out to stop you in your tracks. This is where the combat system takes front and center, with each of your characters having the ability to wield arms, which are essentially guns that can be upgraded throughout the game by visiting different shops that can be found in pretty much every town you'll come across. As you would expect, each party member has a different type of arm that are either more or less effective against a range of different enemies within the game, helping mix up the combat though with the inclusion of something known as Guardian Forces that play into the game's story and grant you a range of special abilities such as elemental and status resistance or counter-attacks that can help you out in a tight spot. It's not all just about fighting though, as equally prevalent are the amount of puzzles you'll have to solve, as well as side quests that lead to different rewards. If you're the type of player that enjoys seeking out everything a game has to offer, then Wild Arms 3 will be for you. It's chock full of secrets, and if you're willing to go the extra mile, it really pays off. Wild Arms 3 is the definition of a must-have, and if you haven't played it, it's a game that thoroughly deserves a spot in your collection as well. Suikoden V was a real return to form for the series that brought back many of the aspects that made the earlier games so beloved that was sadly missing from the 3rd and 4th entries. The story itself focuses on the young prince of Felina, who's on a journey to reclaim his mother's kingdom after powerful factions within the government took it for themselves. Like past entries, the story is vast in its scope, with plenty of political intrigue, death and betrayal that any longtime fan has come to know and love, but the 5th entry is very much the series at its best, not only in terms of narrative but gameplay as well. As with many RPGs, you'll find yourself exploring the world and coming across a range of different locations brimming with life and NPCs that help push the game forward. But it's within battle that it truly begins to shine. It saw the return of the 6-person parties in combat, rather than the 4 in the previous game, with each of the characters having a certain affinity with different skills. From heavy hitters to the more conservative like archers, there's plenty of choice when it comes to decimating the enemy. Of course, the formation of your party on the battlefield also has its part to play, and there's a range of benefits with different formations, such as increased damage or defense, and if you don't take this aspect into consideration, it's easy to find yourself at a loss, as strategically placing your fighters is the easiest way to give yourself the advantage. Another great aspect of the game is the recruitment system, that sees you being able to take on just over 100 different characters, and while some will join your ranks automatically throughout the story, there's plenty that can easily be missed due to having to meet them at specific times or having to fulfill certain conditions for them to appear. Overall, Suikoden V is simply the best game in the series, and you absolutely owe it to yourself to play this masterpiece if you already haven't. Xenosaga III was the final entry in the series that had a lot of weight on its shoulders, as it had to wrap up the story that was originally planned to span 6 different games instead of 3. Nearly all of the cast returned for this last adventure, and while the story can feel a bit fast paced due to just how much needed to be wrapped up, it ends up being a really enjoyable journey, especially for fans who've been there since day one. That being said, it would have been nice to have seen a few aspects being fleshed out a bit better, but thankfully the gameplay more than makes up for any shortcomings with the game's narrative. The battle system is just as engaging as the previous games and came along with a few changes that made it more efficient and ultimately much more fun to play. Boosting and braking still play a major role, and in the upper right corner of the screen is a gauge that slowly increases the more damage you deal. For 1 boost point, your character is able to get an extra turn, but for 2 you're able to perform one of the many different special attacks that deal great amounts of damage and have the chance to completely flip the tide of a battle in the blink of an eye. Next is braking, and along with the enemies and your HP, you'll notice a break gauge that if filled will see you or your opponents not being able to move for 2 turns, as well as being vulnerable to critical hits. This really helps keep each encounter feeling fair, and of course it's down to you to either focus on boosting or braking, with each coming along with their own pros and cons, lending the battle system plenty of strategy. When it comes down to it, the 3rd installment is easily the best out of the trilogy, and really felt like the culmination of everything that the developers had learnt along the way. It's just a shame that it overall feels slightly rushed, but at least fans were able to get the conclusion they deserved, so if you're looking to give it a go, make sure you check out the previous 2 games first in order to get the most out of it. Legaia 2 is the sequel to an often overlooked RPG on the PlayStation that has very little to do with the first game and instead ends up being a sort of standalone story that throws you into the role of Lang, a young teenage boy who lives peacefully in a village and trains under the stewardship of his teacher. But it's not long until shit hits the fan, with the water supply for the village being stolen, which prompts Lang and his teacher to set out into the world and find those responsible, which eventually snowballs into something far bigger than they could ever have imagined. The story's not exactly anything to write home about, but where Legaia 2 succeeds is with its gameplay. The series follows something known as TAS, or the Tactical Art System, that puts a huge emphasis on combos instead of simply having to select an ability to use it. With this, you enter commands with the D-pad, and depending on the chain of inputs, a different type of combo will occur. As you progress through the adventure, you'll slowly begin to level up and unlock new moves that correspond with different directions, and it won't be long until you're throwing them all into combos that deal out deadly amounts of damage. The enemies themselves though are no walk in the park and put up a decent fight, so it's a good idea to take your time and not just simply try to rush, as that is a surefire way to find yourself with a game over. Now, a major part of the first game was Siru, that allowed its user to perform magic, but with the sequel they no longer exist and are replaced by something known as Origins, which sees each of the characters possessing a different element. These really come in handy throughout the game, as they are not only used in battle but also in the environment as well, allowing you to solve simple puzzles like breaking rocks that often block the path forward, for example. Although not quite as good as the first game, Legaia 2's unique battle system is what really helps it stand out, so if you're looking for something a bit different from the norm, then this one's worth adding to your list. Dragon Quest has long been one of the more popular RPG series, with its roots reaching all the way back to the days of the NES, with each subsequent release coming along with improvements to the formula, and the 8th entry being my personal favourite, that saw you assuming the role of the silent hero who's out to stop a manacled jester that's stolen a powerful staff and begun to wreak havoc upon the kingdom. At its core, Dragon Quest VIII is fairly simplistic and is a much more traditional take on the genre that sees you starting out with a party of 2, but it's not long until more members members join your cause, and this is where the game really begins to open up. Much like the older games in the series, you'll be selecting from a list of different moves you're able to perform, with each of your party members learning more and more abilities as you grow over the course of the game. In fact, the leveling up system is pretty extensive, and each time a character levels up, a certain amount of skill points are given, and it's up to the player to allocate each point into different categories. The more skill points given to a category, the more proficient a character becomes while having that weapon equipped, and several abilities unique to that weapon can also be learnt as you advance. By giving the player the agency to choose their own path forward, it opens up many different ways for each of your characters to evolve throughout the adventure and hone in on what really works best for your approach to each battle. One aspect of the game that truly impressed back in the day though were the visuals, that took on a cel-shaded aesthetic and perfectly fit the tone and nature of the journey. The cel-shaded renditions of the character and monster designs truly give the game the feel of an anime, with each and every one of their actions coming along with plenty of different effects, giving each fight a sort of cinematic flair that was absent in the franchise prior to this game's release. So if you're looking for the best that Dragon Quest has to offer, then look no further than Journey of the Cursed King. The PlayStation 2 was an absolute dream for RPG fans, and ended up being the best place to find some of the generation's finest examples of the genre. Much like the PS1, the Final Fantasy series played a big role in the console's success, and the 10th entry marked many firsts for the franchise. The biggest was how it left behind the pre-rendered backgrounds of old, and saw the world of Spira being fully realised in 3D. Another was the inclusion of voice work to help portray the story of Tidus, and even though there are plenty of moments throughout the game where it doesn't exactly work, it provided a much more cinematic approach to the narrative, which all revolved around an enormous and mysterious creature known as Sin. After being swallowed by it and transported nearly 1,000 years into the future, you've got to try and find your way home, which sees you teaming up with various characters who've all got their own stories to tell. The battles in FF10 are by many considered the best in the series, and put the ATB system on the shelf, meaning that your characters no longer had to take action based on a countdown, but that you had all the time in the world to plan your strategy before making a decision. You've got the usual options from basic attacks to powerful magic and summons, with each of your party members specialising in one of these different fields, but a huge departure from what had come before is how the game dealt with the growth of these characters. It introduced the sphere grid, and by defeating enemies you would acquire different types of spheres, which then allowed you to move around the grid for a set amount of spaces, with each node offering up a new ability to learn. Because of this, it's possible to create different builds for each party member, allowing you to cater them to your strengths. If you've been living under a rock and still haven't got round to playing Final Fantasy X, it's easily available with the HD remaster on modern systems, and it is one adventure that you won't want to miss. Well, that does it for today's video. Keep an eye out for part 2, as that will be coming up soon, so don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell to get notified about new videos which release every Monday and Thursday. You can follow me on all of the socials, which are linked below, to stay up to date, and also join my growing community on Discord to meet many like-minded gamers to continue the conversation with. I'd like to give a special shout out to my Patreon supporters: Rhino, Skilljim, Shuden, Richard, Amy, Athenium Mind, Daniel, Dio, Omar, Strider, Pierre, Carl, Awesome Jacket Dude, Maximus, Scott, Alfred, Terry, Ryan, Alex, GameCube Galaxy, Clear Salaryman, Fake, and Paddy J for their continued support that helps make these videos possible. If you're interested in joining my Discord or supporting the channel through Patreon, you'll find all of the links down below. As always, thanks for taking the time to check out the video. I'll catch you next time.